Welcome to the Humanity and War live stream. This is Andrea Harrison with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I'm here with David Kilcullen. We're glad that everyone could join us today. If you're not viewing this live, you're going to view it later. You can check it out at humanityanwarblog.com. We also encourage you to send in any questions or comments you have via Twitter at #UrbanWar. So we're going to get started. David, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thanks for having me.
We have a couple of questions we wanted to start off with today and really give you an opportunity to talk about some of your work. But then we're also going to have hopefully some questions from online viewers that we'll get to over the course of the next hour or so. So you once said, I've been reading through some of your essays and your books, and you once said that the key influence on contemporary conflict is globalization. Could you start off explaining some of the trends that have led to the prevalence of urban conflicts, such as the impact of globalization, littoralization, and discuss where these trends might be headed in the future?
Yeah, so in my work, I've really drawn out 4 key, very long-term trends that I think kind of set the background conditions for a lot of what we're dealing with in modern conflict. And those are population growth, urbanization, littoralization, as you mentioned, which is the tendency for human populations to cluster around coastlines. And then most importantly, and the newest one, is the massive expansion in electronic connectivity. So let me talk about each of those in turn. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the total population of the planet was only about 750 million people. It took 150 years for that population to double, mainly as a result of improvements in public health, education, and so on, to about 1.5 billion people in 1900. It then took only 60 years for the population to double again to 3 billion people in the year 1960. It then doubled again in only 39 years to be 6 billion in 1999. And in the 15 years or so since the beginning of this century, we've added about another 1.2 billion people. So we're looking at 7.2 billion people on the planet today. The projection for where that will be by the middle of the century, which largely comes from people within the UN in the Bureau of Economic and Social Affairs, is something between 9.2 and 9.5 billion people on the planet. So another way of putting it is, within the next generation, we're going to see roughly the same number of extra people on the planet, 3 billion, that it took all of human history to generate right up until 1960. So huge population growth and ongoing population growth. Second factor is urbanization. So again, if we go back to roughly the same time frame, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, only about 1% of people on the planet lived in a city. By 1900, it's 10%. By 1960, it's about 25%. By the year 2008, the world passed the 50% urbanization mark. So today, for the first time in history, more people live in cities than, and that trend is again set to increase, so that by the middle of the century, about 75% of people, or roughly the same as the entire global population today, will live in urban environments. And that, in fact, is the basis for saying, you know, war happens where people live. It has always had a bit of an urban tendency because people fight to control cities. But that's going to increase because more people will just live in urban environments. It doesn't mean that there won't be warfare elsewhere. It just means that if we're thinking about the future, urban conflict is going to be a critical element to consider. Third element is littoralization. Because cities have always been trading hubs, and because it's a lot easier to move heavy trade goods by water than on land, there's always been a slight coastal tendency of cities. They've tended to cluster on coastlines. So as people move to cities, they move to pre-existing cities, which means that population has tended to cluster around the littoral environment. So today, about 80% of people on the planet live within 50 miles of a coast. And, you know, at the turn of the century, out of, let's say, 25 megacities on the planet, only 4, Moscow, Beijing, Mexico City, and Tehran, were not located on a major river delta or on a coastline. So very strong coastal tendency, and that makes a difference to how conflicts develop. It also brings a very large number of people into significant amount of vulnerability with respect to things like climate change, sea level rise, coastal weather events, exposure to the sorts of risks and threats that come out of non-war type environments, just mass natural disaster and man-caused disaster. And then the final one, which is actually the most dynamic right now, is the massive explosion of connectivity in the third world, in particular, what I like to call the global south, although the military still refers to it as the third world. But this has happened in really since the year 2000. So just a couple of facts on that. In the year 2000, in Nigeria, there was only 30,000 cell phones for the whole country. By 2012, there was 113 million. If we look at Syria in the year 2000, there was no cell phone system, no internet. If you wanted a satellite dish, you could get one over the black market from the Syrian army, actually. But there wasn't very much to watch on it because you didn't have a lot of access to satellite television or the internet. Today, there's 4 or 5 cell phone networks. It's easy to get access to the internet. When we talk to people in Syria, we're not dealing with a dearth of information. We're dealing with a huge amount of access to connectivity. That fundamentally changes the way that warfare happens. It also changes how the humanitarian response to war happens. So those are sort of background trends, and we can pick those up in more detail if you like as we go through. But I think that kind of sets the conditions for what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And just to remind our viewers who might be joining us right now that David's bio is available at humanityandwarblog.com, and to join us on Twitter at #UrbanWar to send us your questions. So following up on sort of these trends, do you have sort of a working definition of urban warfare, or could you explain a little bit about why urban warfare is so different, or maybe it's not, but how different it is from conventional, traditional warfare, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, well, so I think the definition is really simple to say, although it's complex to analyse. It's warfare in cities, in and around cities. I look a bit more broadly than straight warfare because a lot of my work focuses on urban unrest and on safety of human populations in rapidly growing urban environments. So, to some extent, the violence might be politically motivated, it might be warfare, or it might be criminally driven,
Right.
or a result of a breakdown in the environment. And I think, for example, in 2013, Al-Shabaab attacked a mall in the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, killed about 50 people. And obviously that was a horribly terrible event. But if we look at the violence patterns in cities in Kenya, gangs in Kenya kill about that same number of people every month, right? So, to someone that lives in a slum in Nairobi, it kind of doesn't matter if it's killed by a guy from Shabab or by, Mungiki, one of the gangs. So I think I tend to look at it as being violence that takes place in an urban environment. It has a number of particular characteristics when you get into straight up warfare in that environment. One is very short sight lines, so you don't get to see very far. You don't see what's in the buildings. That means you get very short range, fleeting, short duration engagements, and it means that a lot of mistakes get made and a lot of people can be targeted incorrectly, or there can be an environment where you fire into a building or the enemy fires into a building and that targets civilians or others that are in there. We need to recognise, I think, that urban warfare has been reasonably constant through history. What we're dealing with now is a very widespread pattern of urbanisation, so that it's really hard for civilian populations to move out of the way of conflict. And the Syrian conflicts and some of the other conflicts we've seen, particularly in Africa, have been good examples of where urban warfare tends to take place in a very cluttered and a highly populated environment, one that's full of civilians. And I think that imposes not only a series of constraints on the way that military operations develop, but I think it imposes some sort of different obligations for combatants in terms of thinking about the impact of their operations on the civilian population. You only have to look at what's going on now in northern Syria and essentially the use of the human population of Aleppo as a bargaining partner in peace talks by the Assad regime. And you can see how the presence of a big collection of cities in an urban environment sort of changes the options that are open to combatants. And it's something that I and others are kind of worried about as we look at conflict going forward.
Okay. And you mentioned Syria, you mentioned Kenya as places where there might be, or at least Somalia, Al-Shabaab areas, places that might have current sort of high levels of violence in urban areas. In some of the research you've done, have you identified areas that are really have a high potential for future violence, certain urban areas that are growing very rapidly, or anything of that nature, sort of the problem spots for the future?
Right. So let me just say that urbanisation generally, both in the data and in current research, is actually a good thing, right? It's generally associated with improvements in education, in prosperity, public health, women's reproductive freedom, and on most measures, when you look at urbanisation, it's a good thing. The issue comes when you have urbanisation that's too rapid or takes place in a way that doesn't allow for a city to cope with the pace or the scale of urban growth, and when institutions, in particular social and governance institutions, don't include large portions of the new urban population. A lot of the research that has been done by the military recently has focused on megacities, so typically defined as cities with a population of 10 million or more. But some of the more recent research in the UN suggests that actually the fastest growing cities, many of them are small and medium-sized cities, and again, mostly coastal. So I tend to look at cities that are in the global south generally, but not only, that are rapidly growing, where there is not an inclusive governance or economic structure. And what we find is that economic inequality doesn't tend to lead directly to violence. It's when you have a combination of economic inequality or social exclusion and an inability to get from your current situation to a situation of inclusion. So people feel excluded and they seek to resort to violence in order to respond to that.
Okay, thank you. So kind of chatted with about this, as well as the War on the Rocks blog. They all were sort of pointing out to me as this sort of reversal of norms that seems to have happened since World War II, where after World War II you saw this real push to protect civilians. You had the Geneva Conventions of 1949. There was a real sort of realization of the sort of devastation of the civilian population during World War II and steps taken to try to prevent this for the future. But this seems to be, in some ways, deteriorating. We look back at the last war here in Iraq. There was a tremendous cost in civilian life between 2003 and 2011 during the U.S. invasion and subsequent counterinsurgency operations. What lessons do you think that the United States should have learned from the conflict in Iraq in particular in terms of protecting civilian life? And any lessons for sort of future urbanized conflicts and how they could better protect civilian life?
Yeah, so I actually think, I'm not so sure that the norms are reversed. And I want to just make the observation that this whole idea of the responsibility to protect is a relatively new norm that we've seen come into UN language and into the use of other organizations, really since about the mid-1990s. And this is the idea that the international community has both a right and an obligation to intervene in an intra-state conflict when that conflict starts to really affect civilians. And that, I think, is actually an expansion of international humanitarian norms. But I agree with you in that it's being used in ways that sort of manipulate that norm to achieve political goals. And I would particularly look at, for example, the behavior of Russia in Ukraine, the way the Iranians have engaged in Syria, as examples of sort of twisting that norm to further particular goals. We talk about Iraq specifically. As most people know, I think the numbers are a little bit rubbery on Iraq. The Iraq Family Health Survey said that there were about 150,000 violent deaths in the first 3 years of the conflict. The Iraq Body Count Project, which in my view is probably one of the better ones because it's based on solid documentation, talks about 174,000 roughly civilian and combatant deaths, of whom about 112, something like that, were civilian. On historical grounds, that's actually very low for this kind of conflict. And I think the reason that we tend to see it more closely is partly because of the massive expansion in connectivity that allows us to have much greater visibility of that, but also because in the case of Iraq, the war was very concentrated in an urban environment. So when I first deployed to Iraq as part of the surge in the beginning of 2007, at that time more than 50% of total combat action in the war in Iraq was happening inside Baghdad city limits. So the war was really focused and concentrated on the urban environment, so in a very populated area. about 80% of those casualties, the sort of 112,000 civilian casualties that we saw in Iraq, were inflicted by insurgents, right? Not by the coalition. And I think that's the other, to me, that's the key lesson. When you're in an urban environment that's very populated and you're dealing with an urban insurgency, the ability to protect the population becomes incredibly difficult. Because if you don't put onto the ground the level of troop numbers that you need to actually live with the population, build a relationship, and protect them, then they become incredibly vulnerable to targeting. And most of the deaths that we saw of civilians were not accidental combat deaths. They were deliberate targeting as part of sectarian cleansing or other conflict, like deliberate attempts to kill the population. Similarly, if you look at Afghanistan today, about 80% of civilians being killed now are being targeted by the insurgent or by a variety of different insurgent groups. That's not surprising because there's hardly any coalition troops left. But the civilian casualties, particularly women and children, in the last year in Afghanistan, are the highest we've seen since before the surge. So I think that kind of shows you that it's not unique to urban warfare, but it's just Afghanistan's a much less urban conflict than Iraq was, but it does very much concentrate it, and it makes the civilian population much more vulnerable because they're stuck in that environment and it's hard for them to move. The other thing that I point to with respect to Syria, of course, is massive population displacement, and I think everyone's aware of that, 11 million people displaced, and of course there's an indirect mortality that comes as a result of that. And the Lancet, which is a British medical journal, estimated that excess mortality in the war could have been up to 600,000 people, which is huge, primarily as sort of indirect effect of violence. And so the urban environment as an amplifier of the indirect effects of warfare is another thing to think about as we think about that conflict environment.
Great, thank you, that was great. Just a reminder again to the viewers that you can watch this online at humanityandwarblog.com, and we actually have a question in from one of our online viewers at the moment, and please continue to send these questions in to #UrbanWar. So the question is, how will the expansion of urban guerrilla warfare alter the operational space for humanitarian providers?
Well, I think we can, and this is a great question. We can see this happening already, and I think it's going to continue to happen. That in many conflicts there really is very little humanitarian space, and I think in fact in some ways the concept of humanitarian space itself is somewhat challenged by the use of governments or use by governments of civilian populations as bargaining counters. And again, the Syrian civil war is a great example of that, where we've seen starvation, sieges. We've seen over the last 3 weeks an attempt to encircle the city of Aleppo completely and cut it off from the outside world as a way of positioning the Syrian regime in a strong position ahead of peace talks. So we're seeing populations being used in a way that really, as one of your previous questions suggested, has been more or less outlawed in international usage since the Second World War. And I think it's not just an artifact of the urban environment, it's also because countries are deciding to do that, but it's something that we should be very worried about because it leads to issues like manipulation of food and water supplies, destruction of the electricity, which is a huge deal in places in the Middle East where the water system runs on electricity in many countries, and things like the manipulation of aid convoy and humanitarian access. And that puts humanitarian providers or NGOs or organizations like the ICRC in a really difficult position. You may in fact be playing into the hands of one combatant or another. 25 years ago, General Ruth Smith, who was the deputy UN commander in Bosnia, made the point that in a civil war of that kind, any kind of humanitarian assistance is not impartial. By helping one population, you're hurting another, and that sort of tends to mean that humanitarian space really constricts. Now, I think it's still critically important that we get into these environments and deliver to the greatest extent possible impartial humanitarian assistance to populations that are vulnerable. I guess we also have to just be aware that that's potentially going to have political impact that we need to consider.
Right, and in some of your work, have you sort of witnessed some of this manipulation by armed groups or by governments? Do you have any examples that sort of come to mind?
Oh, yeah. So in 2013 and into early 2014, we did my teams did a study in Aleppo where we looked at who controlled which parts of the city and how that control was exercised. And, I would point to three things. One is restrictive checkpoints. So people creating, different combatants creating checkpoints that allow them to control access into and out of given areas, and in particular to control the access of humanitarian agencies into those areas, and using that access as a way to force population compliance with what they were trying to achieve. The second one is price manipulation. So people basically manipulating the cost of critical foodstuffs, like in Syria, wheat flour and cooking oil in particular, and using that to either cement their control over a population or deny another combatant's control. And the third element is something that we saw not only in Syria, but we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere, which is denial of essential services, so electricity and water in particular, and areas that don't support a particular group being essentially cut off. And of course, when you cut off in a rural environment, there are many more options for survival or for moving or recovering from lack of essential services by relying on your ability to grow food or to harvest things from the environment. You're living in a city block in Aleppo, you don't have that opportunity, and so that kind of urban environment makes that more difficult for the civilians.
And following up on this, the Syria conflict in particular, I mean, it's a which is controlled by ISIS, IS, ISIL, as it may be called. And here there's a lot of big urban areas as well under the control of ISIS. What would be your recommendation for humanitarian actors who are trying to access the populations in these ISIS-controlled areas, and what are some things maybe they should think to avoid? Any recommendations that you would have?
Well, this is a classic example of an environment where there's very little humanitarian space. You're not seeing, INGOs getting into Raqqa or getting into Mosul, for example. Some people are delivering assistance, and I think the bravery and dedication of people that are managing to do that is incredible. But I think that on a large scale, we're really seeing. I tend to see these populations as almost very large-scale hostage situations. Let's talk about Mosul as an example. So you mentioned Syria, but it's worth pointing out, and I think everyone's aware, that ISIS controls about 11 cities now across both Iraq and Syria. They've lost some in the last few months, and I think we'll see more. But I think most people expect the largest, most decisive battle to take place in and around Mosul sometime in the next year. Mosul started off with a population of about 1.2 million people. Many people have fled. It's majority Sunni, but it has a very substantial Kurdish minority before the war and a substantial Shia minority, many of whom have been really heavily targeted by ISIS for persecution and murder since they arrived. ISIS controls the water system and the electrical system. There are two electrical generation stations. Mosul split by a river. It has a bunch of bridges across that river. So basically it has two power systems, one on either side of the river. And the power and the water supply have become increasingly difficult for ISIS to maintain over the last year. And it's largely denying efforts of others to assist the population. So you're now looking at a population that's getting maybe 2 hours of electricity a day at best, and the water supply is very contaminated and hard to access. So if we're thinking about how to engage with that humanitarian population, from a combatant standpoint, part of it would simply be, breaking ISIS's control of the city, possibly creating enough breaches in the berm around the city of Mosul to allow humanitarian assistance to get in there. Right now, there are only a very limited number of breaks in the defensive berm around the city, and they're all controlled by ISIS checkpoints. This is another example of use of restrictive checkpoints. The other thing would be to focus, I think, on issues like water and on medical support. There have also been examples of air delivery of humanitarian assistance. So we saw that with the encircled Yazidi population in Mount Sinjar in 2014. Australian aircraft have also dropped humanitarian supplies into besieged areas of Syria, including areas that are besieged or controlled by ISIS. I think this becomes, for me anyway, the ethics are when I'm delivering aid remotely in that way to a population that's under the thumb of an organisation that's really trying to exploit and manipulate access to humanitarian supplies. Am I in fact helping the population, or am I really just cementing the control of that bad actor over the population? And I think if there's any, for me, if there's any chance of helping the population, it's worth doing. But I think we also sometimes have to consider the fact that, you know, it may be worse than useless. You may just be creating trade goods that the group that's inflicting pain on the population can use to manipulate them.
Great.
Yeah, whether it's by airdrops or by neutral, convoys, to do it that way.
Great, and of course, I mean, under humanitarian law, there certainly is an obligation to allow humanitarian relief, but whether or not parties respect it is a whole other question.
Yeah, obligation that's not usually respected these days by about half the combatants that we're talking about.
Yeah, so it's a huge problem. So here's another question from an online viewer, and again, people can continue to send this in to #UrbanWar, questions that they have. So this viewer asks, what about training for urban warfare? How will that happen in urban settings, or do you think a lot of trainings, I assume here we're talking about military training, will happen rurally?
So generally speaking, we find that you need to train in the environment where you're going to operate, and training for urban warfare, in fact, whether it be military or for emergency services or humanitarian agencies, really needs to take place in an environment that mimics the urban environment, ideally in an urban environment, but if not, in a training facility designed for that. And those do exist. There are a number of them in the United States, Australia, the UK, and Europe, and in Africa as well, actually. Those are usually used by the military and police for training. But I certainly think there's value in humanitarian agencies thinking about how would we run, for example, a urban relief operation scenario and train people to deal with the difficulties that are involved in that. I think there's also huge opportunity now through online and simulated training and use of simulations for planning and in some cases immersive urban training. That stuff's developing all the time. But, I think it's really a matter of deciding what's your training objective, to what extent does that rely on having urban space within which to train, and then how can you compensate for the fact that you're never going to have an actual city, with real-life population and combatants that you can just, practice in. You're going to need to have that as a simulated environment. The other thing that is very important is on-the-job training. So not throwing people directly into incredibly difficult circumstances straight up, but gradually getting people, if you like, inoculated and socialized to the urban environment.
Right. So you mentioned actually in an earlier answer, or just now actually, that there's a lot of law enforcement in cities as well. So you're not just dealing with the military, but there's going to be this sort of blending of police services, of firemen, and then of actual soldiers and combatants. Do you see this as causing additional problems? Because of course these people will be trained in different ways, they'll have different objectives. Have you witnessed this and seen any issues with this?
So Western countries' coalition policy in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere for the last 10 or 15 years, in fact going back to Bosnia, has been that we prefer to see cities being controlled by civilian police rather than having military bases and military checkpoints all over the place. That is not the policy of folks like the Assad regime, for example, but generally speaking, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, as soon as it was possible to get the military out of cities, the goal was to do that and to have civil police running the urban environment. And the assumption of that is that they'll have a closer relationship with the population, they'll be less heavily armed, they'll have better information on what's going on, so less likely to make mistakes, and that they'll be more likely to be part of society and therefore think about the threats a little bit differently. It hasn't always worked out, and we've seen environments where, in fact, we've created the space for an abusive relationship between police and the community, particularly where we've got a sectarian dimension or an ethnic dimension where the police come from a different religious or ethnic background than the population. And there's a number of examples of that from both Iraq and Afghanistan that show you that you've got to be very careful about that. We've also had instances where, and Iraq is a great example, where certain police units went rogue and had to be either completely disbanded or subjected to really strict supervision in order to reform them. And I'm thinking of certain units of the Iraqi National Police during the very strong sectarian period of 2005 to 2007 in Iraq. And some of those units had to be broken up. Some had to have Western advisors put in down to the squad level to make it work. And I think what we need to realise is, yes, primarily we want police in the urban environment, but they have to be trained properly and they have to be supervised properly and they have to look like the people that they're protecting. Otherwise, if you get a different ethnic or religious makeup, it can be a recipe for abuse.
So moving sort of on with that same thought of partner forces, of training and equipping different forces, there has been sort of a shift, especially for coalition troops, as you mentioned, the U.S. included, though maybe less so for the U.S., sort of moving away from this large footprint and into this lighter footprint, and towards training and equipping partner forces, maybe to carry out the operations on the ground in certain cases. How will this affect the ability of Western powers to ensure the protection of human rights in war zones they are involved in, but where they might have less direct influence over the actors, over the police forces, over the military? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there are three issues here. One is this issue of influence. Another is the issue of reform versus capacity building. And then the third one is an issue of information and intelligence. So to pick up each of them in turn, you're perfectly right. You don't have influence over a partner in the way that you have influence over your own forces. So when you work with a partner organization or you're embedding advisors in that organization, in many ways you take on responsibility for that partner's actions, but it's very hard to ensure that the partner's behavior is going to meet international norms or meet the levels to which they've been trained and all those kinds of requirements. We've seen at different times, we've seen it work very well. The model that works particularly well, that we've seen in both Afghanistan and Iraq, is something called the embedded partnering model, where you have civilian, military and police all working together, and you have whole units of coalition forces and local forces partnered, so that you've got a squad with a squad or a platoon with a platoon. That's great when you can do it, but it takes huge amounts of resources, and it doesn't achieve the kind of small footprint element of what your question refers to. So more often we see one or two advisors with a unit, or trainers that train people in their peacetime location, but when they go off into the operational environment, they don't accompany them, and that really does limit the ability to influence. The second issue, excuse me, so the first one is influence. The second one is, actually I'll skip to the third just briefly, the issue of intelligence. One of the problems of the light footprint comes out when you have a partner force operating on the ground, and we are providing air support or sort of artillery or strike support for them. And your problem is that you lack situational awareness when you don't have your own people on the ground. And in an urban environment, the issue is not deciding what to shoot at. The issue is figuring out where are the civilians, who is that's in that environment, are there people in there that are not legitimate targets, and all those kinds of questions. And you can see from things like the MSF hospital incident in Kunduz last year, that even if you've got manned aircraft with pilots who are on station over the target area, it's incredibly difficult to be sure of what you're shooting at in that environment. And so not having your own people on the ground really does limit that intelligence and information and situational awareness. And I do think that that tends to create, in some cases, a backlash. Just quickly on the other point of capacity development versus reform. Much of what we've done over the last 15 years has really been focused on building the capacity of partners, and much less has been focused on governance reform and humanitarian reform. And I think we need to shift our focus going forward, because we run the risk of teaching corrupt cops to be better at being corrupt cops, or teaching oppressive militaries to shoot straight, and that doesn't solve the problem, right? You have to be thinking about this as a reform effort as much as a capacity development effort.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So this is and again, for our viewers online, please continue to send in your questions, #UrbanWar. So the question here is, do you think there will be a surge in non-lethal approaches to conflict and urban war?
I would like to think that, and certainly the US Marine Corps 20 years ago started a program in non-lethal weapons in urban environments, and the US Army and others have followed that lead. There's been a lot of work done thinking about what we call less lethal type environments, and that ranges from everything from your classic kind of barriers and crowd control and non-lethal type just protective measures, through things like selective lethality munitions, where you can actually dial into a small diameter bomb, a particular level of lethality that you're trying to achieve. I do, though, think that we're still going to see a very high level of lethality in urban environments, partly because it's always multi-sided, and we can be as restrained as we are in our application of force in the urban environment, but there's still an enemy out there who is using force in a relatively unrestrained way. And the other issue is this issue of discrimination that we've already talked about. You may not know what you're shooting at.
Right. And kind of getting back to the proxy forces a little bit, or the partner forces again, are there things that governments can be doing better on the vetting end of things to upfront sort of know who their partners are, or do you think that that's not really where the problem lies and it's more in the training and down the road, or where do you see the best? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that is really important when you're dealing with a non-state partner, so like a guerrilla group or a militia, or in some cases a people's self-defense organization that you see in certain areas. And a lot of work's been done over the last few years on things like biometrics and understanding people's DNA or fingerprints, or the ability to understand when we give a group certain assistance, where does that assistance end up? And that's certainly a key element here. When you're talking about states, partner states, you tend to be forced into an environment where you're relying on vetting that's carried out by another government. And to some extent, you're at the mercy of their systems. I think the US in particular has been very good at humanitarian vetting, and we have important developments like the Leahy Amendment from the 1980s that really forced the US military to look very closely at the human rights backgrounds of the people that it's working with. Sometimes that can work really well. So a good example of that is Colombia, where the Colombians themselves internalized a lot of the international norms, did their own work on prevention of human rights abuses, and actually, I believe, called in the ICRC to assist them in developing training programs and helping their guys master it. That's a rare exception of a country that, in many ways shares that value and is seeking to put it forward. A lot of other places where we work, the state just isn't as effective as that, or there are people in play that aren't interested in achieving those goals. And then I think you've got a really tough decision. Actually, in some ways, it's not a very tough decision. It's that you need to walk away when the partner is not supporting those norms, because ultimately I think that can really heavily undermine the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Okay, and another question coming in that takes us to continue. Remedial measures are available when partner forces do commit human rights IHL violations. Do states have some way of correcting this behavior, or leave?
Yeah, well, I think in an intrastate conflict, there's some fairly clear protection of civilians rules in IHL, and there's also some important norms that have been established, particularly over the last decade, that are really important. But I think that actually the biggest and most effective thing here is this expansion of electronic connectivity that we talked about earlier. because it's much harder now to hide evidence of humanitarian atrocities, because you've got people with cell phones, with cameras, the ability to put the imagery and video up very quickly, and to verify from multiple sources the kinds of things that otherwise in the past might have been able to be hidden by a state or a non-state actor. So preserving that, what I would call transparency through electronic connectivity, I think is actually a really important first step now in preserving the safety of the population, making it harder, just making all actors, whether they're state or non-state, realise that their actions are being monitored and the international community is keeping an eye on what they're doing. Does seem to have, not for everybody, but for many actors, even people like Assad's regime, seems to have a dampening effect on some of the violence that we see. So I would point to that as sort of a new opportunity that we have now because of this issue of electronic connectivity.
Right. But I guess connectivity also changes the way that the fighters on the ground are fighting as well, because they have more access to information, and especially I would imagine it enables non-state actors to operate in a way that they were unable to before.
Yeah, we're now seeing non-state groups using cell phones, Google Earth, apps on smartphones to achieve a degree of precision in weapons use that really used to be just the preserve of states, and in fact are better than many states can achieve. So yeah, it's definitely changing that environment, and also because when you're talking about an urban environment, you're talking about a place where there's lots of workshops and light industrial facilities, and you've got a population that's generally quite technically literate and can make DIY weapon systems and put them in the field. And we've seen that in Syria and particularly in Libya and other places over the last several years. And that again is different from when you're operating in an urban environment to when you're operating in a rural location where those resources just aren't there.
Right. And it's interesting, I'm not sure how it works in other contexts. Australia or the EU controls are specifically on software and sort of this devices. And of course they're wanting to target those persons who would maybe be using them to conduct warfare, to conduct some sort of criminal activity. But as you said, it's those tools, those same software, those same devices can be used in a positive manner by humanitarian actors, by civilians themselves to protect themselves. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, I would always tend to preserve the transparency because I think it's just such a powerful restraining force, preventing people from carrying out atrocities. But I think there are times when you want to be very careful about what's out there. Yeah.
And here another question coming in from online: how do you deal with the prevalence of misinformation in your urban information and the sort of analysis of urban violence?
Yeah, this is a great point. So the issue now is not getting information. Information is easy to get. We have what you might call a self-revealing environment that just basically it's much easier to get information. But you've got severe problems with attribution, so deciding who's responsible for particular actions and validating that information. And the traditional way to do that, of course, is by looking at the reliability of the source or that source's access to information and doing kind of a handcrafted, analysis of each source. What we're seeing now more and more is the use of sort of big data techniques and data science techniques to validate by volume, and essentially saying, I've got 500 reporting sources, everything from, civilian people tweeting through what we're seeing in the movement patterns of, police units, through price data, through, traffic data, bringing that all together and then saying we're going to, you can apply basic statistical techniques to get a best fit around sort of central tendency of the data and strip out stuff that are outliers. So I think there are techniques, but I'm a big believer in that you need to put somebody on the ground to validate what you're seeing in the remote picture. Otherwise, it's really hard to interpret what's going on. Once you've done that a few times, you can begin to identify, if you like, the delta between what you see remotely and what your field teams are identifying, and then you can start to make some informed guesses about what's going on elsewhere. And that's important in a war zone because, of course, when we're running humanitarian field teams or we're trying to do monitoring and evaluation for aid, you can lose people if you don't carefully try to figure out where what's the best vantage point to observe the conflict. Too close, you lose people. Too far away, you get the wrong answer. So it's a bit of a balance.
And do you advise a lot of humanitarian actors as part of your work on how they can be more secure, how they can avoid getting into situations where they are targeted by local populations or by non-state actors, whoever might be on the ground? And what are some of the things you do? Yeah,
well, most of our teams' works in Afghanistan and Syria and so on have been focused on what everyone's familiar with as M&E, monitoring and evaluation, so understanding where the aid's going, who is stealing it, what's happening to it, what's the situation of civilian populations, and how is that being affected by the conflict. And most of our clients on that side are NGOs or humanitarian aid agencies. I think all of them are that. We do sometimes offer specific individual advice to people around safety of field workers or the specific operational environment in a given area. And of course that varies depending on who's asking the question. I'm talking here about aid agencies or NGOs. We do reasonably often get approached by what I would call early entry aid agencies, people that go in the beginning of conflicts or the beginning of natural disasters. A lot of that is around geospatial work. So there's a company in our group called First Mile Geo that has built a platform that allows aid workers to pool information, share information remotely, put that information into a geospatial platform, and then perform actually pretty sophisticated geospatial analysis, including figuring out where the threat is and where the vulnerability of the population is, without having to be sort of experts in GIS. And that has a Arabic, Spanish, and English interface right now, and it's been used fairly widely, including by the American Red Cross, actually, in a number of places to gather data and figure out how to analyze the operational environment. And actually, if people want to go to the website, there's a couple of examples from Syria and elsewhere of people using that tool to generate humanitarian assessment.
Sorry, and that was on your website or on?
Firstmilegeo.com, and okay. I should have probably told them that people were going to go look at their website, but there's a few case studies that you can take a look at.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think I have time for one more quick question that came in. So how do you effectively balance counterterrorism and urban counterinsurgency training?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Balance counterterrorism with...
So how do you effectively balance counterterrorism and urban counterinsurgency training? I'm not sure exactly what was meant either, but if we can...
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
It's early morning, I'm guessing. I think the question's about sort of kinetic targeting of bad guys versus protecting the population. That's how I'm interpreting it. So counterterrorism and counterinsurgency are kind of buzzwords that have been kicking around for the last 10 years or so. But so just to step away from those labels, there is a sort of operation that you want to carry out in an urban environment that's about reducing the threat by targeting threat actors, right? And that could be arresting them or killing them or trying to push them out of an environment. And most of the concern in an urban environment when you're doing that is around targeting. Are we targeting the right people? Are we perhaps generating collateral damage that's going to hurt vulnerable civilians? Are we disrupting an urban environment in such a way that people that are indirectly affected are going to suffer? So there's a lot of sort of harm minimization elements around that aspect. But then there's another element, which is how do you get people out of a situation where they're being victimized by armed groups? And a lot of that is building a relationship with communities, building their own resilience, helping them sort of help themselves and get themselves out of a dynamic where they're very dependent on external actors. And one of my critiques of the way that humanitarian assistance is sometimes done in war zones is that we're all looking for our most vulnerable population and we're looking for how we're delivering assistance, and we measure our effectiveness based on am I delivering what they need? And that's important in an early entry environment, but long term, you sometimes run the risk of generating dependency, and then you create communities that are unable to help themselves. So I think as we train for both of those, it's important that people understand that I might be delivering humanitarian assistance, but I'm doing it in an environment that's highly complex and very dangerous, and I may be creating second or third order effects that are harming the population that I'm trying to help, or I may actually be putting my own team at risk and just laying out a big target set that the bad guys can attack. So I don't want to end on a real negative, but people are probably aware that Syria, the Syrian conflict is moving towards peace talks. Let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine for a moment that magically tonight peace breaks out, right? And there's been a peace deal that's been achieved overnight, and all sides to that agreement are going to implement that. We're now looking at 11 million displaced people in Syria. Half the country is destroyed. Most of its cities, most of its economy, its education and health system are all totally trashed. We're probably looking at a 10 to 20 year reconstruction and stabilization effort in Syria that could involve several 100,000 international peacekeepers, humanitarian aid agencies, and others trying to assist in that process. And yet Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda ally, and the Islamic State, ISIS, are not parties to that peace deal. So we'd be in an environment where we're trying to reconstruct a country and stabilize it, but we still have 50,000 armed actors running around that haven't signed up to the peace deal that are attacking our field teams and trying to undermine that. And we know they have a track record of incredible abuse against the population. So the challenge for guys like you and guys like me in a slightly different part of the humanitarian and conflict space is thinking about how do I stabilize and engage in and reconstruct a country like that without getting dragged into something that looks a hell of a lot like during the Iraq War all over again. And the urban environment just makes that more difficult. So that, to me, if I had the opportunity to sort of advise people on what we want to be thinking about now, it's we want to get ahead of the curve and think about what is that reconstruction and stabilization process going to look like. Eventually that is going to be required. It's not going to be easy, and I think we need to be thinking ahead now to how it's going to look and what we might need to be training for and preparing for and planning for in thinking about that.
I think that's a great answer. I'm not sure if that's what the viewer was asking, but it was a fantastic explanation. So, and I think you're very right. So, so we're going to wrap up. Unless you had some final remarks you wanted to make.
No, just to thank you guys for having me on. And as most people know, I'm part of the New America Foundation Future of War program, which is how we set that up. So I want to thank them for making this happen. And just to say that, I'm just one of a couple of dozen people on that program, and there's a lot of work being done to think about the future conflict environment. When it's put that way, it sounds like it's a military activity, but actually we're very interested in environmental impact on civilians, creating more humanitarian space, working with actors like the ICRC and others to try to figure out how to ameliorate some of these conditions of 21st century conflict. Organizations like the Red Cross come out of changes in conflict that happened in the 19th century, and people recognizing that if we want to preserve humanitarian norms, we have to think about how warfare is changing. So I hope that you guys can be part of a conversation about that with us at New America going forward as we think about how 21st century warfare is going to change some of these norms and the way that we carry out our obligations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that information. That's great. And thank you for taking your time. I know it's very early there in Sydney. So I think we're going to wrap up here. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You can, again, watch this video of David Kilcullen at humanityandwarblog.com. And thank you to all the Twitter persons who gave us questions. They were great. So thank you. Have a great day.